There's something unique about how certain people carry their memories. It's not nostalgia in the common sense, but a kind of continuous internal dialogue where the past doesn't stay behind, it walks alongside, shaping every decision without fanfare. Those who grew up in the 1970s experienced a unique childhood without screens, without instant answers, without constant validation, and this left invisible but profound marks. These marks aren't wounds, they're traces, mental patterns that continue to operate silently even decades later. There's a quiet resilience in these people, an ability to sustain themselves emotionally without depending on external applause. They learned to trust themselves because there was no other option, and this silent confidence became part of who they are. This video isn't about romanticizing the past. It's about observing, with curiosity and respect, how certain mental habits form in childhood and remain as invisible pillars of adult personality. If you grew up in the 70s, or know someone who did, you might recognize these traits, and perhaps you'll understand, for the first time, why certain things about you always seemed different, not better, just different. If anything in this topic sounds familiar to you, please share it in the comments. This is a quiet space for reflection and identification, the quiet nostalgia that 1970s kids carry when revisiting old mental routines. There are moments when an old song plays or a specific scent appears, and something inside ignites. It's not just a memory, it's an involuntary return to a mental state that existed before the world sped up. For those who grew up in the 70s, these mental routines were built in silence, unsupervised play, entire afternoons without anyone asking where you were. The mind learned to entertain itself. This nostalgia isn't about wanting to go back in time. It's about recognizing that that way of functioning is still active. When life gets heavy, these people tend to seek quiet spaces, moments where they can simply to be without explanation. They don't need external distractions to feel complete. Their own company has always been enough, and that remains true. The interesting thing is that this mental pattern is rarely conscious. It's not something you announce. It's simply an internal habit of returning to a safe emotional place where things made sense because they were simple. And perhaps that's why, even amidst modern chaos, these people managed to find calm because it was already within them from the beginning. The way in which childhood memories shape an internal dialogue of self-worth throughout life. There's an inner voice that everyone carries, but for those who grew up in the 70s, that voice has a particular tone. It's not shrill or overly demanding. It's firm but gentle. It was formed in a time when children resolved their own conflicts, created their own games, and rarely received praise for simple things. Self-worth didn't come from the outside, it needed to be built internally, brick by brick. This created a specific type of self-esteem, resilient but quiet. These people don't need constant validation because they learned early on that it wouldn't always come. When they achieve something, the recognition that matters most is their own. It's not arrogance. It's just an old mental pattern that says, I know what I'm capable of, and that's enough. And perhaps that's why so many of them avoid self-promotion or seeking the spotlight. This internal dialogue also acts as a compass. In moments of doubt, it recalls small childhood victories, that time they fixed something on their own, or when they overcame a fear without anyone noticing. These are memories that don't make sense to tell others, but which, within the mind, serve as silent evidence of strength. And this, subtly, continues to guide decisions to this day. The inner drive to measure each choice against standards that were born in the silence of the 70s. There's an invisible filter through which certain people pass their decisions. It's not something conscious, but it's always there, an internal yardstick that measures value, effort, authenticity. For those who grew up in the 70s, this yardstick was calibrated in a time when things needed to last, when commitments were taken seriously, and when a person's word carried weight. These references never left their minds, they just adapted to the modern world. Therefore, these people tend to question themselves more before acting. It's not insecurity, it's a mental habit of verifying if something truly makes sense, if it aligns with the values that have always been there. They distrust shortcuts, easy promise, anything that seems superficial, and this can make them seem cautious or even rigid, but in reality, it's just fidelity to an internal standard that was established decades ago. The curious thing is that this impulse also generates a feeling of displacement. The world has changed rapidly, and the choices of others don't always make sense to those who measure everything by that old yardstick. But instead of judging, these people simply observe and continue to follow their own criteria, even if it means walking alone sometimes, because deep down, they trust that inner voice more than any passing trend. If you've noticed this pattern in yourself or someone close to you, right, this makes sense. This helps this video reach more people. The intimate feeling of being different even without saying anything, a mental habit that never dissolves. There's a perception some people carry from a young age that they see the world from a slightly different angle than others. It's not superiority or deliberate isolation. It's simply a silent awareness that certain values, certain ways of reacting, are no longer so common. For those who grew up in the 70s, this feeling began when the world started to accelerate, and they realized they hadn't accelerated along with it not because they couldn't, but because they chose not to. This feeling doesn't create drama. It's not something you mention in conversations. It's simply a mental habit of observing, of noticing small differences, how others handle commitments, how they react to frustration, how they seek approval. And in this observation, there's a quiet recognition that I function differently, not better, not worse, just different. And this, in a way, has always been there. The interesting thing is that this difference has never been something to be corrected. For these people, it's part of their identity. There's no need to fit in completely, because childhood has already taught them that it's possible to be okay even on the margins. And prior evening group, they maintain a certain emotional autonomy and inner space that remains untouched, no matter how close the relationships are. The small inner voice that compares current moments with expectations formed decades ago. There's an automatic mechanism that operates silently. The mind compares the present with past references. For those who grew up in the 70s, these references are solid. They were formed in a time when things had a certain weight, a certain permanence. Each new situation passes through this invisible filter. Does this live up to what I would expect? Does this make sense according to what I've always believed? It's not conscious judgment. It's just the mind doing what it's always done. This habit can generate a strange feeling of disharmony. The modern world values speed, supervision, and instant gratification, and these people feel internally that something doesn't fit. They can't simply accept everything as normal. There's a voice that whispers, but it should be different. It should be more consistent, more genuine, and this voice, though discreet, never completely falls silent. The curious thing is that this comparison isn't nostalgic in a sad sense. It's simply a frame of reference that remains active. These people continue to expect things to have substance, gestures to have real meaning, and relationships to be built with time and care. And when that doesn't happen, They don't complain loudly, they just retreat a little, preserving that inner space where the old patterns still make sense. The mental habit of idealizing overcome challenges as marks of an unproclaimed elite identity. There's a silent way of seeing things that doesn't need a stage. For those who grew up in the 70s, childhood challenges, however, small became internal tests of ability, fixing something broken on your own, exploring places without a map, spending hours creating solutions to simple problems. None of this was celebrated publicly, but it remained etched in memory as evidence of strength, and that evidence has never lost its value. This mental habit transforms past experiences into markers of identity. It's not arrogance. It's simply a quiet conviction that I've been through tough times and I've handled it well, and this creates a kind of unwavering self-confidence that doesn't need to be proven to others. These people don't brag because, for them, these achievements are just part of what it means to be who they are, not something extraordinary, just what's expected. The interesting thing is that this perception of elite is completely internal. There's no desire for external recognition. There's only a tranquil feeling of knowing that, when necessary, resilience will be there. And perhaps that's why, in times of crisis, these people seem so calm, because they already know, deep down, that they can get through it. It's a mental pattern that has been solidified over decades and has never needed to be revised. The subtle way in which imagination revives past achievements during moments of inner doubt. There's a mental resource that kicks in when confidence wavers. For those who grew up in the 70s, imagination isn't just for creating, it also functions as an emotional archive. In moments of uncertainty, the mind retrieves small scenes from the past. That afternoon when they solved something impossible, the day they faced a fear and came out unscathed. These are quick, almost automatic images, but they carry enough weight to stabilize the present. This mental habit isn't romantic nostalgia. It's an emotional survival strategy. When the present seems too unstable, the mind searches for past evidence that stability existed beforehand, that it was achieved without external help. There's no need to talk about it. It's simply an internal process that happens in seconds, remembering, feeling, recognizing that I've done this before, in a different way, and that's enough to move forward. The curious thing is that these memories are rarely grand. They aren't great public achievements. They are small personal victories that no one else witnessed, but which remain etched as evidence of competence. And perhaps it is precisely because they are small that they work so well, because they don't need to be justified or explained. They simply exist, silent and solid, ready to be revisited whenever necessary. The mental dialogue that transforms simple memories into silent proofs of resilience. There's an internal narrative that some people construct without realizing it. Each little childhood memory isn't just a memory, it's a piece of evidence. For those who grew up in the 70s, these pieces have accumulated over the decades, moments of autonomy, of forced creativity, of problems solved without an instruction manual. And the mind has organized all of this into a coherent story about who these people are. This mental dialogue is mostly unconscious. It operates behind the scenes, reinforcing an identity built upon real experiences. When a new difficulty arises, the mind automatically seeks parallels. I've faced something similar before. Not exactly the same, but similar enough, and this connection, however small, generates a feeling of familiarity with the challenge, as if it were already somewhat resolved, simply because it wasn't completely new. The interesting thing is that this internal narrative is unshakable. No matter how many times the world changes or how many uncertainties arise, these people will always have access to this mental library of past evidence. And this doesn't make them invincible, but it keeps them strong, because resilience, for them, is not an abstract quality. It's a proven pattern, tested over decades, and it continues to work exactly as it always has. If this analysis helped you better understand certain habits, comment, "Now I understand." Your participation strengthens the community. An internal observation of how these traits continue to guide decisions without one realizing it. There's an emotional autopilot that operates without warning. For those who grew up in the 70s, everyday decisions are rarely random. They pass through an invisible filter, shaped by years of mental habits. Choosing to spend time alone instead of socializing, preferring to fix something instead of replacing it, valuing consistency over novelty. All of this happens naturally, without conscious reflection, because these patterns are already deeply ingrained. The curious thing is that these people don't always realize they're being guided by traits formed decades ago. They simply feel that certain choices make more sense than others. There's no complex rationalization. It's just an internal inclination, a preference that seems too obvious to question. And when someone asks why they act a certain way, the answer is usually simple. I've always been like this, because, in fact, they always have been. This automatic functioning brings a silent coherence to life. There are no frequent identity crises, nor abrupt changes of direction. There is a continuous line between the past and the present, invisible but solid, and perhaps that is why these people seem so stable, not because nothing shakes them, but because the traits that sustain them have never changed. They simply continue doing what they have always done, guiding, protecting, keeping everything in balance. The intimate moment when you accept that these inner voices define who you are without telling anyone. There comes a point in life when resistance ends. It's not giving up, its quiet acceptance. For those who grew up in the 70s, this moment happens when they finally recognize that those inner voices, those old patterns, are not flaws to be corrected. They are their very essence. They are what makes these people who they are. And there's no need to explain this to anyone, because it only makes sense from within. This acceptance doesn't come with fanfare. There's no public declaration or visible change in behavior. It's simply an internal adjustment, a silent reconciliation with the fact that I've always been this way, and that's okay. Comparisons with others lose their power. The need to fit in diminishes. What remains is a quiet peace, built on the certainty that these traits formed in the silence of the 70s are not flaws. They are foundations, and perhaps the most beautiful thing is that this acceptance doesn't need to be shared. It exists only in the intimate space of one's own mind, where the inner voices are finally heard without judgment. There is no more struggle against them. There is only recognition, this is me, it always has been, and it always will be, and in this recognition, there is a strange freedom, the freedom to stop trying to be something else and simply exist as one has always existed. These traits don't appear on resumes or get mentioned in casual conversations. They exist silently, operating behind the scenes of personality, shaping choices without making a sound. For those who grew up in the 70s, these internal marks aren't nostalgic, they're functional. They're the foundation upon which everything else is built. And perhaps the most interesting thing is that these people rarely realize how different they are, precisely because these patterns have always been there. There's nothing extraordinary about recognizing this. It's not about being better or worse than other generations. It's simply about understanding that certain experiences leave lasting impressions. and that these impressions continue to guide life in subtle and profound ways. If you recognized yourself in these descriptions, know that you are not alone. There are many who carry these same inner voices, these same silent references, and who also find strength in them. Self-knowledge doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes it's simply that recognizing patterns, accepting origins, and continuing to live with a little more clarity about who you are. And if this video helped you see something that was always there, then it fulfilled its purpose. Has this behavior ever caught your attention at some point in your life? Share your experience in the comments. If you enjoy content that helps you better understand your own mind, subscribe to the channel. Here we explore common mental habits in a clear and human way.